Welcome to Mystery Cafe, your ultimate stop for gripping detective stories, chilling mysteries, and unforgettable investigations. Here, every video serves a fresh dose of suspense, shocking twists, and cases that challenge your inner detective. From classic whodunits to modern crime stories, we bring the world of mystery straight to your screen, where every clue matters and no secret stays buried for long. Before we start unraveling today's mystery, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa. Drop your country, city, or stay in the comments, and let's see how far the Mystery Cafe family reaches. Magnifying glass tilted right.
The Quiet House on Widow's Lane. Chapter 1. The Unsettling Silence. Jessica Fletcher had always believed that silence, when it lingered too long, was never truly empty. It was the sort of morning Cabot Cove specialized in: mist rolling lazily off the harbor, gulls calling to one another as fishing boats creaked against their moorings. Jessica stood at her kitchen window, mug of coffee warming her hands, watching the town wake up at its unhurried pace. On mornings like this, the world felt balanced, predictable, safe. That sense dissolved the moment the phone rang. Jessica glanced at the clock. Just past 6:30. No one called at this hour unless something was wrong. She lifted the receiver on the second ring. Jessica Fletcher. There was a pause, long enough to be uncomfortable. Mrs. Fletcher? The voice belonged to Emily Harcourt, her tone brittle, as if it might shatter at any second. I'm sorry to bother you so early, but it's Harold. Jessica's grip tightened. What about Harold? He didn't open the house this morning. No lights, no movement. And Harold never misses a morning walk, ever. Jessica closed her eyes briefly. Harold Whitcomb was many things: reclusive, stubborn, and fiercely private. But unreliable was not one of them. For 20 years his routine had been as precise as the tide tables. A walk at dawn, breakfast at 7, shop open by 8. I'll come by, Jessica said gently. Stay where you are. Widow's Lane curved away from the town centre like a question mark, lined with aging houses that leaned toward one another as though sharing secrets. Harold's home sat at the very end, shrouded by old pines and an iron gate that hadn't been locked in decades. Jessica found Emily waiting near the path, wringing her hands. I tried knocking, Emily said. Called his name. Nothing. Jessica approached the front door. The silence pressed in thick and unnatural. She knocked firmly. Harold, it's Jessica Fletcher. No answer. She tried the handle. It turned easily. That's odd, Emily whispered. He always locks it. The scent hit them first, polish and old paper, with something colder beneath it. The house was immaculate, as always. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, just stillness. They found Harold Whitcomb in his study. He sat behind his desk, glasses folded neatly beside him, hands resting as though mid-thought. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. Jessica did not need a doctor to know he was dead. Emily let out a small, broken sound. Jessica stepped closer, her instincts already working. Harold's posture was too deliberate, too composed. A man does not die so neatly by accident. She noticed the single sheet of paper on the desk, blank except for a faint indentation, as though something had been written and torn away. The pen lay capped, aligned perfectly with the edge. What was he working on? Jessica asked softly. Emily shook her head. He wouldn't say, just kept muttering about mistakes, about fixing something before it was too late. Jessica's gaze drifted around the room. Shelves packed with old journals, locked drawers, framed photographs turned face down, a life carefully controlled and carefully hidden. Sirens wailed in the distance. As Sheriff Metzger arrived moments later, Jessica felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Cabot Cove had seen its share of tragedies, but this felt different, intentional, personal. She looked once more at Harold Whitcomb at the quiet house on Widow's Lane and knew with chilling certainty. Someone had wanted Harold silenced, and whatever secret he'd been guarding had just become deadly.
Chapter 2. Threads Beneath the Surface. By the time the coroner's van pulled away from Widow's Lane, the morning mist had burned off, leaving Cabot Cove exposed in the harsh clarity of daylight. Jessica stood near the iron gate, arms folded, watching Sheriff Metzger confer quietly with one of his deputies. Harold Whitcomb's house looked unchanged, still, orderly, and deceptively peaceful, but the illusion had been broken. "Well," Metzger said, approaching her with a weary sigh, "you were right to call it early. Coroner says heart failure, but not the natural kind." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" "Meaning something helped it along. No signs of violence, no toxins we can identify yet. But the timing, the posture, it doesn't sit right." "No," Jessica agreed, "it doesn't." Metzger glanced back at the house. Harold kept to himself. No close family, no enemies that anyone knows of. On paper, he's the least likely murder victim in Maine. "On paper," Jessica said, "but people aren't paper, Mort." She excused herself and walked slowly back toward town, her thoughts already organizing themselves into neat, uncomfortable questions. Harold Whitcomb had lived in Cabot Cove for over 3 decades, yet very few people could claim to know him well. He ran a small archival shop near the harbour, maps, deeds, town records, things most people only cared about when they needed proof of something. Proof was power. Jessica stopped by the shop just as the bell above the door chimed. Inside, the air smelled of dust and ink. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, each labelled in Harold's precise handwriting. Evan Price, the young man who occasionally helped Harold catalogue documents, stood behind the counter, pale and distracted. "Evan," Jessica said gently, "I'm sorry about Harold." He swallowed hard. "I still don't believe it. He was here late last night, said he needed to set something straight." "Did he say what?" Jessica asked. Evan shook his head. "No, just told me to go home, that if anyone asked, he'd been alone." Jessica's eyes sharpened. "Did anyone ask?" "Not yet." She walked deeper into the shop, scanning the shelves. "What kind of work was he doing recently?" Evan hesitated. "Town records, old ones, property transfers mostly." "Anything unusual?" "He was frustrated," Evan admitted. "Kept saying the town had built itself on a lie. I thought it was just Harold being dramatic." Jessica thought of the indentation on the blank paper in Harold's study. Words written, then destroyed. Truth discovered, then hidden again. "Did Harold have conflicts with anyone over these records?" she asked. Evan shrugged. "Some people didn't like him digging around, said he stirred up old ghosts." "Who?" Jessica pressed. Before Evan could answer, the bell chimed again. Margaret Lowell entered, impeccably dressed, her expression tight with concern. Margaret was chair of the Historical Preservation Committee, a woman deeply invested in Cabot Cove's past and how it was presented. "I heard about Harold," Margaret said, her voice carefully modulated. "Such a shock." "Yes," Jessica replied. "It is." Margaret's eyes flicked briefly to Evan, then back to Jessica. "Harold and I didn't always agree, but I respected his work." "Disagreements about what?" Jessica asked casually. Margaret smiled thinly. "Interpretation. History is delicate, Jessica. One must be careful not to damage the town's reputation with speculation." "Facts aren't speculation," Jessica said. Margaret stiffened. Facts can be misread. She left shortly afterward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Evan exhaled. She argued with him yesterday, told him to stop reviewing certain files. Which files? Jessica asked. The original land grants from before Cabot Cove was officially incorporated. Jessica felt a familiar chill. Old land records were never just about land. They were about ownership, inheritance, and money. She thanked Evan and stepped outside, where the harbour glittered deceptively bright. Cabot Cove bustled on, blissfully unaware that its foundations might be less solid than it believed. That afternoon, Jessica paid a visit to the town hall archives. She signed the ledger and descended into the basement, where shelves of aging boxes rested like sleeping witnesses. She found the section Harold had been working on. Several folders were missing, too neat to be theft by chance. Jessica replaced the box lid and sat back, piecing together the pattern forming in her mind. Harold had found something significant enough to frighten him, something that challenged the town's accepted narrative. He'd written it down, then someone had come for him. As she stood to leave, she noticed a faint scrape on the concrete floor leading toward the back exit. Recent? Deliberate? Someone else had been here? Recently? Jessica paused at the top of the stairs, the weight of the realization settling heavily. Harold Whitcomb had not just uncovered history. He had uncovered motive, and whoever was responsible was still very much part of Cabot Cove's present.
Chapter 3. The Weight of Old Names. Jessica Fletcher slept poorly that night, not because of fear, but because her mind refused to let go of unfinished thoughts. Harold Whitcomb's life had been defined by order, yet his death was anything but accidental. By dawn, she was already dressed, her notebook tucked under her arm, heading toward the harbour. Cabot Cove's fishermen were a reliable source of truth. They noticed things, boats that moved at odd hours, strangers who lingered too long, patterns disrupted. If someone had been out late near Widow's Lane, someone down by the docks would have seen it. She found Amos Tupper repairing a net near his trawler, humming tunelessly. "Morning, Amos," Jessica said. "Morning, Mrs. F. You're up early." "So was Harold Whitcomb," Jessica replied. "Until yesterday." Amos's hands stilled. "Yeah." Word travels fast. "Did you see anyone unusual last night?" she asked. "After dark?" He scratched his chin. "Saw a car I didn't recognize. Dark sedan, parked near Widow's Lane around 10. "Anyone get out?" "Couldn't see from where I was, but it didn't belong to a tourist. No rental stickers." Jessica thanked him and continued along the pier, her thoughts turning. Harold had sent Evan home early. He'd been alone, at least officially. Someone had visited him, and not as a friend. Later that morning, Jessica drove to the edge of town where the old Whitcomb cemetery plot rested, half forgotten beneath leaning stones and overgrown grass. Harold had once mentioned his ancestors in passing, early settlers, founders of sorts. Founders often left complicated legacies. She knelt beside a weathered headstone, Elias Whitcomb, 1841 to 1903. Below it, nearly illegible, were the words, "Custodian of the First Deeds." Custodian. Jessica straightened, the term echoing in her mind. Harold hadn't just been a shopkeeper. He had inherited a role, one tied to records others may have preferred forgotten. Back in town, she paid a visit to Judge Calvin Brewster, retired but still influential. His office overlooked the square, walls lined with certificates and portraits of Cabot Cove's founding families. "I assume this isn't a social call," Brewster said, peering over his glasses. "No," Jessica replied. "It rarely is." She asked him about early land grants, particularly those predating the town's official charter. Brewster's smile thinned. "Ancient history, settled matters." "Settled by whom?" Jessica pressed. By time, he said curtly. Why the interest? Because Harold Whitcomb was reviewing those records shortly before his death. Brewster's fingers tightened on his pen. Harold had a tendency to chase shadows. I'd hate for you to do the same. So would I, Jessica said calmly. Which is why I prefer facts. He ended the conversation shortly afterward. As Jessica stepped outside, she noticed Margaret Lowell across the square, speaking animatedly with a real estate developer, Daniel Hargreave, new to town, ambitious, and very interested in coastal property. Harold's property records. That afternoon, Jessica returned to Widow's Lane. Sheriff Metzger had cleared the house for limited access, and she walked through it with deliberate care. This time, she noticed what she'd missed before, a faint scuff on the rug near the study bookshelf. She pushed gently. The shelf swung inward. Behind it, a narrow recess revealed an empty compartment, recently emptied. Whatever Harold had hidden, it wasn't here anymore. On his desk, she re-examined the blank page. Holding it up to the light, faint impressions emerged, enough to make out partial words. Said unlawful transfer. Signature forged. It cannot be allowed to stand. Jessica felt a chill. Forged signatures meant invalid claims. Invalid claims meant fortunes built on nothing. The door creaked behind her. She turned to see Margaret Lowell standing in the doorway. I thought you might be here, Margaret said quietly. Looking for something? Jessica asked. Margaret's gaze drifted to the desk. Harold was wrong, she said. Whatever he thought he found, it would have destroyed this town. Or corrected it, Jessica replied. Margaret's expression hardened. Some truths do more harm than good. And some lies do even more, Jessica said. Margaret left without another word. As dusk settled, Jessica sat alone in the study, the weight of history pressing down around her. Harold Whitcomb had uncovered forged deeds, proof that Cabot Cove's most respected families may have profited from theft generations ago. And someone had decided that keeping the past buried was worth killing for. The mystery was no longer about how Harold died. It was about who stood to lose everything if he'd lived long enough to speak. Chapter 4. Fault Lines. The town council meeting that evening was unusually crowded. Jessica took a seat near the back, notebook closed but mind alert. Whenever Cabot Cove gathered in numbers, it meant one of two things: celebration or fear. Tonight leaned heavily toward the latter. Sheriff Metzger stood at the front, clearing his throat. I want to assure everyone that Harold Whitcomb's death is under investigation. At this time, there is no reason for public alarm. A murmur rippled through the room. Margaret Lowell rose immediately. With respect, Sheriff, rumors are already circulating. It would be irresponsible not to address the damage this speculation is doing. Jessica noticed Daniel Hargreave sitting 2 rows ahead, fingers steepled, watching Margaret closely. Damage to what? Jessica asked aloud. The room went still. Margaret turned slowly. To Cabot Cove's reputation. And whose reputation is that exactly? Jessica continued. The town's, or certain families within it? A few heads turned. Others avoided eye contact. Daniel stood. I'm new here, but I can tell you this. Uncertainty freezes investment. People are already hesitating. Jessica met his gaze. Because uncertainty threatens your deals? Because truth threatens stability, Margaret cut in. No, Jessica said evenly. Secrecy does. Sheriff Metzger raised his hands. Enough. This isn't a courtroom. Yet, Jessica replied. After the meeting dissolved into uneasy conversation, Daniel intercepted her outside. You're stirring things up, he said quietly. I'm following evidence, Jessica answered. You should try it sometime. He smiled thinly. Evidence can be interpreted. So can guilt. That night, Jessica received an anonymous envelope slid under her door. Inside was a photocopy of a land deed, one of the missing files. The signature at the bottom had been altered, just enough to shift ownership. Written in pencil at the top, Harold wasn't wrong. The next morning, Sheriff Metzger arrived at her house earlier than usual. "We've got a problem," he said grimly. Daniel Hargreave was found unconscious near the docks. Head injury. Someone pushed him. Jessica's expression remained calm. "Was anything taken?" "No, but his briefcase was soaked. Papers ruined." Convenient, Jessica thought. She visited the docks that afternoon. The tide had washed away most traces, but a fisherman pointed out a scrape along the edge, signs of a struggle. "Did you see anyone?" Jessica asked. "Margaret Lowell," he said without hesitation. "She was yelling at him earlier, real heated." Jessica nodded but said nothing. Anger alone didn't make a killer. Motive needed teeth. She returned to Harold's shop, where Evan was packing boxes. "I'm closing early," he said. "Too many questions." "Evan," Jessica said gently, "did Harold ever tell you where he kept copies?" Evan hesitated, then nodded. He didn't trust anyone fully, said redundancy was survival. "Where?" Evan reached beneath the counter and pulled out a false ledger. Inside were microfilm strips. "Everything," he whispered. "Every forged transfer, every illegal claim." Jessica felt the weight of it. Proof Harold had died to protect. As she left the shop, she noticed Margaret watching from across the street, her face unreadable. That night, Jessica received another call, this time from Sheriff Metzger. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, voice tight. "Someone broke into town hall. Archives were targeted." Jessica closed her eyes briefly. The fault lines were shifting. Whoever was responsible was growing desperate. And desperate people, she knew, made mistakes. Chapter 5. Desperate Measures. Jessica arrived at Town Hall just as dawn crept across Cabot Cove, the pale light catching on the cracked stone steps. Sheriff Metzger was already there, rubbing his temples as deputies moved in and out of the building. "They knew exactly where to go," he said as she joined him. "No general damage, just the archive room." "Which means they weren't looking for chaos," Jessica replied. "They were looking for control." Inside the basement, several cabinets stood open, their contents rifled through with a precision that suggested familiarity. Whoever had done this knew the system, knew which files mattered and which were irrelevant. "They didn't take much," Metzger added. "Just the earliest deeds." "Or thought they did," Jessica said quietly. She didn't mention the microfilm yet. Knowledge, like evidence, had value only if protected. Later that morning, Jessica visited Daniel Hargreave at the clinic. He lay propped up in bed, a bandage across his temple, irritation radiating from him more than pain. "I was attacked," he said flatly. "I want that on record." "I'm sure you do," Jessica replied. "But I'm more interested in why." He scoffed. "I was threatening people's secrets." "Which people?" she asked. He hesitated just long enough. Margaret Lowell made it clear she'd rather burn every record than see her family name dragged through the mud. "And yet," Jessica said, "nothing was stolen from you." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think I staged it?" "I think someone wanted it to look personal," Jessica said. "A distraction." She left him fuming. That afternoon, Jessica walked to the old boathouse near Widow's Lane. It had belonged to the Whitcomb family for generations, long before zoning laws and committee approvals. The lock was rusted, but recently used. Inside, dust hung in the air, disturbed by fresh footprints. She followed them to a work table where papers had been spread and hastily gathered. One document remained, a letter from Harold to an attorney in Portland. If anything happens to me, the enclosed materials prove the original coastal claims were illegally transferred in 1927. Several current property owners are aware of this and have actively suppressed the truth. Jessica folded the letter carefully. Harold had known the risk. He'd been preparing for exactly this. That evening, Margaret Lowell requested a private meeting. They sat in Jessica's living room, the tension palpable. "You have no idea what you're playing with," Margaret said. "If those records come out, lawsuits will tear this town apart." "Accountability often does," Jessica replied. "My family donated land for the school, the hospital, everything," Margaret insisted. "We've been caretakers." "Caretakers don't forge signatures," Jessica said calmly. Margaret's composure cracked. "It was my grandfather. He fixed a mistake by creating another." Silence stretched between them. "I didn't kill Harold," Margaret said finally, "but I won't apologize for protecting Cabot Cove." "Protecting power," Jessica corrected. Margaret left shortly afterward, her shoulders rigid. That night, Evan called Jessica, his voice shaking. "Someone tried to break into my apartment," he said. "They knew about the microfilm." Jessica's tone sharpened. "Are you safe?" "For now." "Pack a bag," Jessica said. "Come here." As she hung up, Jessica looked out at the quiet street, acutely aware that the danger had shifted. Harold's death had been a warning. The attack on Daniel, a misdirection, the archive break-in, a search. But now the target was Evan, and whoever was behind it was running out of options. Desperation, Jessica knew, often forced the truth into the open, one way or another. Chapter 6. Pressure Points. Evan arrived at Jessica's house just before midnight, carrying a single duffel bag and the strained look of someone who had stopped trusting shadows. Jessica ushered him inside, locked the door, and drew the curtains without a word. Cabot Cove, usually so comforting in its stillness, felt watchful now. "You did the right thing," she told him, as he sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped tightly around a mug he hadn't touched. "Whoever is involved won't take unnecessary risks anymore." "That's what scares me," Evan replied. "They're not unnecessary risks." Jessica nodded. She had spent enough time around criminals to know the moment when calculation gave way to panic. The next morning, Sheriff Metzger paid an unannounced visit. "You keeping Evan Price here?" he asked. "For his safety," Jessica said, "which incidentally aligns with yours." Metzger sighed. "Someone tried to torch Harold's old boathouse last night. Fire department got there in time." Jessica closed her eyes briefly. Destroy the evidence. Burn the past. "They're escalating," Metzger said. "I need something concrete, Jess, not suspicion." "You already have it," she replied. "You just don't know where to look." She handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a duplicate microfilm strip Evan had quietly made before bringing the originals. Metzger stared at it. "This proves forged land transfers." "And motive," Jessica added, "for more than one person." Metzger leaned back. "Margaret Lowell's family, Daniel Hargreaves' investors, half the preservation committee." "Which is why the killer is hiding in plain sight," Jessica said. "Someone respected enough not to be questioned too closely." That afternoon, Jessica asked the sheriff to arrange a meeting at Town Hall, framed as a routine update on the investigation. Invitations went out quickly. Too quickly. Margaret arrived first. Daniel followed, pale but determined. Judge Brewster entered last, his expression unreadable. Jessica waited until they were all seated. "Harold Whitcomb didn't die of natural causes," she began calmly. "He was coerced." Silence. "He uncovered proof that early coastal properties were acquired illegally," she continued. "That proof still exists." Daniel stiffened. "That's impossible." No, Jessica said. What's impossible is believing Harold would destroy his own work without copies. Judge Brewster's voice cut in. Where is this proof? Safe, Jessica replied. For now. Margaret's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Then why are you all here? Jessica asked. The room grew tense. Jessica turned to Judge Brewster. You advised Harold to stop his research. You had the authority to bury it. Brewster's jaw tightened. I advised caution. You forged nothing, Jessica said, but you protected those who did. She turned next to Daniel. You didn't care about the past, only the future. Developments on stolen land would have been worthless. Daniel swallowed. I never touched Harold. No, Jessica agreed. You were a convenient victim. Someone needed you attacked to shift suspicion. Finally, she faced Margaret. You argued with Harold, Jessica said. You had motive, but you also had something more dangerous, access. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. You visited Harold the night he died, Jessica continued. Not to kill him, to convince him. Margaret spoke, voice cracking. He wouldn't listen. And when he threatened to go public? Jessica asked. Margaret hesitated. Too long. Judge Brewster rose abruptly. This is absurd. Jessica turned sharply. You were there too? The room froze. You followed Margaret, Jessica said. You realized Harold's proof implicated not just families, but legal approvals you signed decades ago. Brewster's face drained of color. You pressured Harold, Jessica said. And when he refused, you induced cardiac arrest using a drug that mimics natural failure. Metzger stepped forward. Judge Brewster, you're under arrest. Brewster sank back into his chair, defeated. As deputies escorted him away, Jessica felt no triumph, only sadness. A town's history had been shaped by fear, not truth. The mystery was nearly resolved, but consequences, she knew, were only just beginning. Chapter 7. Aftershocks. The arrest of Judge Calvin Brewster did not bring immediate peace to Cabot Cove. Instead, it sent shockwaves rippling through the town, disturbing routines that had gone unquestioned for generations. Jessica felt it the moment she stepped outside the sheriff's office and noticed the way conversations stopped when she passed. Truth, once exposed, rarely arrived quietly. By mid-morning, the local paper had printed an extra edition. Headlines spoke of forged deeds, judicial corruption, and the Whitcomb files. Names long associated with generosity and civic pride were suddenly paired with words like suppression and fraud. Some townspeople reacted with anger, others with disbelief, and a few with grim recognition. Jessica returned home to find Evan seated on the porch, staring out at the street. They're blaming Harold, he said bitterly, saying he stirred this up on purpose. He did, Jessica replied gently. That doesn't make him wrong. Evan shook his head. I keep thinking, if I'd pushed him harder to go public sooner, then he might have been killed sooner, Jessica said. Courage doesn't guarantee safety. It only guarantees truth eventually. Later that afternoon, Margaret Lowell requested another meeting. This time, she arrived without the carefully arranged composure she usually wore like armor. My family's name is finished, Margaret said, sitting heavily on the sofa. No, Jessica said quietly. Your family's myth is finished. That's not the same thing. Margaret looked up sharply. Do you know what this town will lose? Yes, Jessica replied. It's illusions. But it may gain something more important. Margaret's voice dropped. I didn't know Brewster would kill him. I believe you, Jessica said. But you knew enough to stop him. And you didn't. Margaret closed her eyes. I thought preserving the town mattered more than one man. Jessica's expression softened. That's how these things always begin. That evening, Sheriff Metzger stopped by with an update. "Brewster's talking," he said. "Not much, but enough. He claims the forged deeds were corrected injustices, that the land would have gone unused otherwise." Jessica sighed. History rewritten by the powerful. "There's more," Metzger added. "He insists Harold planned to leak the documents that night, says he panicked." "Fear doesn't excuse murder," Jessica replied. "No," Metzger agreed, "but it explains it." As days passed, Cabot Cove struggled to absorb the truth. Lawyers arrived, surveyors measured disputed properties, development projects stalled overnight, old friendships fractured under the weight of revelation. Jessica visited Harold's grave early one morning. A fresh bouquet lay there, anonymous, simple. "You were right," she said softly. "They weren't ready, but you did it anyway." As she turned to leave, she noticed Judge Brewster's former clerk standing nearby, a woman named Ruth Calder, quiet, observant, often overlooked. "Mrs. Fletcher," Ruth said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did you know it was him?" Ruth asked. Jessica considered the question. Because he had the most to lose and the least reason to suspect himself. People like that convince themselves they're necessary. Ruth nodded slowly. "He always said Cabot Cove needed guardians." "And sometimes," Jessica said, "guardians become gatekeepers." That night, Jessica sat at her desk, typing the final chapter of a manuscript she had struggled to complete for months. The story, she realized, had found its ending, not on the page, but in life. Harold Whitcomb's truth would endure, even if the town never fully forgave him for it. Outside, the harbor lights flickered on, one by one, steady and unblinking. The past had been confronted. Only one chapter remained. Chapter 8. The Measure of Truth. Cabot Cove changed quietly. There were no dramatic town exoduses, no public confessions shouted from courthouse steps. Instead, change arrived in paperwork, court filings, and long conversations held behind closed doors. It arrived in the careful redrawing of boundaries, both legal and moral. Jessica Fletcher observed it all from a distance, as she always did when the dust began to settle. Judge Calvin Brewster's confession, once formalized, confirmed what the microfilm had already revealed. The forged signatures dated back nearly a century, part of a calculated effort to consolidate power under the guise of civic improvement. Brewster had inherited the scheme and protected it, convinced that exposure would unravel not just reputations, but the town itself. What he never accepted until it was too late was that Cabot Cove was stronger than the lies it had been built upon. The district attorney arrived from Augusta with a team of auditors and legal historians. Properties changed hands again, this time through courts rather than quiet agreements. Compensation funds were established for descendants of displaced families, their names restored to records where they had long been erased. Jessica attended none of the hearings. Her role was finished. One afternoon, Evan Price stopped by her house, carrying a small box. "I'm leaving town," he said. "Got an offer from the state archives." "That seems fitting," Jessica replied. He opened the box. Inside was Harold Whitcomb's fountain pen. "He wanted you to have this," Evan said. "He wrote it in a note months ago, said if anything happened, you'd know what to do." Jessica closed her fingers around the pen, emotion catching unexpectedly in her chest. He was right. Margaret Lowell resigned from the Preservation Committee quietly. In her place, a rotating board was formed, one that included voices previously excluded from Cabot Cove's official story. Margaret did not leave town, but she no longer tried to control its narrative. Some losses, Jessica knew, could not be undone, only acknowledged. Sheriff Metzger visited one last time before the case was officially closed. "You know," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "most towns would have torn themselves apart over this." "Some almost do," Jessica replied, "but Cabot Cove has always been resilient." Metzger nodded. "You think Harold knew it would turn out this way?" "I think he hoped," Jessica said, "and sometimes hope is enough to start the process." On a crisp morning, weeks later, Jessica returned to Widow's Lane. The Whitcomb house stood empty, sunlight filtering through its windows for the first time without resistance. She walked through the study slowly, touching the desk, the shelves, the hidden compartment now left open. No more secrets. She sat and wrote a single line in her notebook. "Truth is not destructive. It is corrective." As she closed the book, a knock sounded at the door. A young couple stood outside, descendants of one of the families wronged decades earlier. "We just wanted to thank you," the woman said, "for giving us back our name." Jessica smiled gently. "It was never mine to give. It was always yours." That evening, Jessica returned home and placed Harold's pen in its holder beside her typewriter. She began a new manuscript, not a mystery, but a meditation on history, responsibility, and the quiet courage of those who choose honesty over comfort. Outside, the harbour settled into twilight. The gulls quieted. The town breathed. Cabot Cove would never be the same. And that, Jessica Fletcher knew, was exactly the point.